When I first laid eyes on that rotting shack on the edge of Crystal Ridge Lake, the HOA board literally laughed in my face. The kind of laughter that says you don't belong here. You'll never belong here. And that sound burned itself into my memory like gasoline catching fire. Because even back then, while they mocked the peeling paint, the collapsed porch, and the no trespassing sign half buried in mud, I saw something they couldn't: the bones of freedom. The whole neighborhood glittered with manicured lawns, imported tiles, and identical facades that screamed conformity. But this shack, my shack, stood like a stubborn tooth on the waterline. Built before the association ever existed, technically outside its jurisdiction, grandfathered in under some forgotten clause of a 1953 county ordinance. I had scraped together 5 crumpled $1 bills from a garage sale, and the seller, a frail widow desperate to leave town, signed over the deed with trembling hands, whispering that the lake remembers everything. I didn't know what she meant then. All I knew was that for the price of a fast food burger, I owned a slice of paradise. But paradise smelled like mildew and disappointment. The dock sagged into the lake like a drunk. Raccoons had claimed the kitchen as their throne. And when the wind howled through the cracks at night, it sounded like the ghosts of every failed dream screaming through rotten boards. Yet I loved it. I fixed what I could with duct tape and stubbornness, slept on an air mattress under a leaky roof, and told myself that one day I'd turn this wreck into something worth living for. The HOA hated that more than the mold. They hated that someone like me, a contractor's son with oil-stained hands and a pickup older than most of their mortgages, had a foothold in their pristine lake community. They sent letters demanding dues for a property not even on their map, threatened to tow my truck from the gravel shoulder, even tried to block my access road citing environmental protection. I fought every notice with the same weapon they feared most: paperwork. While they held garden club meetings and wine tastings, I spent nights studying property law and county codes, discovering loopholes older than their bylaws. Every time they tried to corner me, I slipped through like water through cracked concrete. The shack became my rebellion. Then came the storm, the one that changed everything. It ripped through the region like vengeance, tearing roofs from mansions, flooding basements, and snapping power lines like matchsticks. When the rain cleared, most of Crystal Ridge Lake was a wreck, but my shack, perched slightly higher on a natural stone ridge, stood untouched. The insurance companies called it luck. The HOA called it an eyesore amid devastation. I called it destiny. With the rest of the neighborhood under repair, investors and developers swarmed like vultures, and I saw my chance. The county's new zoning plan, quietly passed during Reconstruction, reclassified lakefront lots as commercial residential hybrid, skyrocketing property values overnight. My $5 shack now sat on a gold mine. Offers started pouring in, 6 figures, then 7. But I refused everyone, watching the same people who had laughed at me squirm. The HOA president, Cynthia Roth, invited me to a community discussion that was really an ambush disguised in polite smiles and legal jargon. She slid a thick folder across the table. Claiming new environmental codes made my shack non-compliant and that the HOA could acquire it for remediation. I smiled, pulled out my own folder, and quoted the clause from 1953 stating any structure built prior to the HOA's establishment was exempt from such restrictions unless voluntarily surrendered. Her smile cracked. That was the moment she realized I wasn't just some handyman with a dream. I was her worst nightmare, a man who read the fine print. From that day, the war began. Anonymous complaints flooded the county office. Inspectors showed up unannounced. Someone slashed my tires. Drones hovered over my deck at night. But I kept building. Bit by bit, plank by plank, I restored the shack, not into a mansion, but into a fortress of memory and defiance. I added solar panels scavenged from auctions, reinforced the walls with reclaimed cedar, and turned the dock into a gleaming stretch of polished timber that reflected the sunset like bronze. When tourists started coming to the lake again, they didn't photograph the sterile villas behind the gates. They photographed my shack, the lone survivor, the symbol of grit. A travel blogger's post titled "The $5 Miracle House" went viral. Within months, media vans lined the road. The shack became an icon of perseverance, featured in magazines, documentaries, even a real estate special. Reporters called me the man who beat the HOA. That title irritated Cynthia Roth more than losing her backyard tennis court to flood damage. So she changed tactics, from intimidation to infiltration. A man named Brad Ellison appeared one afternoon, pretending to be a documentary producer, wanting to feature my story. He filmed interviews, asked about property history, even offered to help with restoration. Something about his questions felt too precise, too focused on boundary lines and legal easements. I checked his credentials and discovered he wasn't a filmmaker at all. He was a paralegal from Roth and Partners, the HOA's legal firm. They weren't making a documentary. They were mapping out a lawsuit. I confronted him, and he fled, leaving behind a drone controller labeled CR Board Asset. The evidence was enough to expose them, but I held back. Because by then, I was planning something bigger. I had quietly filed a patent for my modular eco-restoration design based on the shack's rebuild. Investors noticed. A sustainable living company offered a partnership. Within a year, what started as a $5 shack had birthed a $5 million brand, Lake Ridge Renewables, Inc., headquartered right on that patch of dirt they tried to erase. The HOA had mocked me for buying trash. Now they needed my permission to access half their shoreline for infrastructure repair. That was when the real theft began. Documents vanished from the county registry. My deed was under review. My access road was suddenly reclassified. And one morning, I woke up to find a bulldozer idling outside my gate with an order to clear unpermitted structures. They were trying to take it all. I stopped the bulldozer with a single move. Stepping in front of it, camera rolling, live stream broadcasting to thousands who had followed my journey. The internet exploded. HOA tries to steal $5 million Miracle House. Public outrage forced the county to freeze the demolition. But while I celebrated the temporary victory, I didn't realize how deep their claws already were. They had forged signatures, bribed officials, and built a case claiming my shack's land parcel was misfiled, technically part of HOA common property. It wasn't just about a house anymore. It was about power, legacy, and the lengths some people would go to erase a man who refused to kneel. I looked out over the lake that night, moonlight tracing the ripples like veins of silver, and I made myself a promise. If they wanted war, I'd give them one. Not in court, not in their boardroom, but on every screen, in every headline, until the whole world knew how far the HOA would go to crush a man who dared to dream for $5. The morning after the bulldozer standoff, I woke up to find my inbox overflowing. Hundreds of messages from reporters, lawyers, activists, and total strangers calling me everything from a folk hero to the man who beat the system. But fame is a funny thing. It shines a spotlight that burns just as easily as it illuminates. Beneath the praise were veiled threats, HOA proxies posting online under fake names, spreading rumors that my shack was built on stolen land, that I'd forged documents, that the whole story was a publicity stunt. At first, I laughed it off. I'd dealt with their lies before. But then my bank froze my business account. Ongoing verification issue, the email said. My construction permits were suspended. A county clerk I'd known for months stopped answering my calls. Bit by bit, I realized this wasn't chaos, it was coordination. The HOA had influence, money, and connections that reached further than I'd imagined. They couldn't take the shack by force, so they decided to starve me out. The first real blow came when the Crystal Ridge Gazette, a newspaper I'd given exclusive access to, ran a front-page story titled, "Did the Miracle Shack Man Cheat the County?" It quoted anonymous sources, accusing me of falsifying restoration receipts and evading taxes. It was all lies, but the damage was done. Sponsors pulled out of my eco-living deal, investors went silent, and the public, so quick to build me up, began to turn. I could feel the noose tightening, but I wasn't going down easy. I spent days digging through county archives, cross-checking parcel maps, deed numbers, and zoning histories. That's when I discovered something monstrous. Cynthia Roth and her board had secretly lobbied to redraw the lake's boundary line 3 years earlier. A subtle shift of less than 50 feet placed my shack's foundation inside HOA jurisdiction on paper. The timing coincided perfectly with the year the market boomed. It was fraud disguised as environmental recalibration, signed by a surveyor later promoted to county zoning director. My hands shook as I pieced the puzzle together. They hadn't just wanted to bully me, they had planned this from the start, turning the law into their weapon. I needed proof solid enough to survive court, but more than that, I needed a way to fight back on my terms. That's when I remembered the storm footage. Back when the whole neighborhood was underwater, a drone camera had captured the real shoreline before the boundary shift. I tracked down the videographer, an old freelancer named Leo Turner, who'd sold his clips to a weather channel. He still had the raw files, time-stamped and GPS tagged. The proof was undeniable. I offered him a licensing fee and, with his permission, uploaded a comparison video showing the before and after maps, overlaying them with the HOA's fraudulent claims. It exploded online. Within hours, Lake Shack scandal was trending. Local news picked it up. By nightfall, national outlets were calling. Roth tried to hold a press conference claiming I was defaming a community institution, but every word she spoke was drowned out by chants from protesters outside the HOA gates. $5 man! $5 man! The tables had turned again, but I'd learned my lesson. Public attention was fuel, not protection. I needed real defense. I contacted a law firm specializing in property rights, the same one that had famously sued an oil giant for illegal land seizure. They agreed to represent me pro bono, calling it a landmark case for individual ownership in HOA-controlled zones. The lawsuit sent shockwaves through the entire state. Depositions began. HOA board members scrambled to lawyer up, but that's when the sabotage escalated. Someone cut my shack's power line in the middle of the night, causing the solar inverter to short and catch fire. Luckily, I woke to the smell of smoke before it spread. I installed cameras, motion sensors, even tripwire lights, turning my home into a fortress of vigilance. Still, I couldn't shake the feeling of eyes watching me from the tree line. One night, I caught a glimpse of a silhouette. Tall, broad-shouldered, standing by the dock before vanishing into the shadows. A few days later, my dog Max disappeared. I found his collar on the road, sliced clean through. That was the moment I stopped thinking of this as a property dispute. This was war. The next week, I attended the preliminary hearing downtown. The courthouse steps were swarmed with reporters, cameras flashing as I walked in wearing my old work boots and a weathered jacket, symbolic defiance against their tailored suits. Roth arrived surrounded by lawyers, smirking like a queen defending her throne. Her attorney opened with a pompous declaration. The defendant's property lies within Crystal Ridge HOA jurisdiction due to the revised shoreline ordinance, therefore subject to community oversight. My attorney stood, calm but surgical. Your Honor, we present Exhibit A, county-recorded drone footage predating the ordinance by 3 years, showing the true shoreline position. Gasps filled the room as the video played, time-stamped GPS coordinates flashing on the screen. Roth's face drained of color. The judge ordered a temporary injunction, halting all HOA actions against me pending investigation. I'd won the first round, but the battle was far from over. Because that night, my shack was broken into. They didn't steal anything, they destroyed. Windows smashed, walls slashed with spray paint reading, "Know your place." The message was clear. This was personal. I reported it to the sheriff, but the deputy just sighed. "Off the record, you're poking powerful people," he warned. I didn't sleep for days after that. The wind off the lake sounded like whispers, and every creak of wood felt like footsteps. Yet amid the fear, something inside me hardened. The shack wasn't just mine anymore. It had become a symbol for every person crushed under the heel of petty power. I decided to make their greed my downfall. I installed hidden cameras disguised as fixtures. I invited a journalist posing as a real estate agent to meet with HOA reps about acquiring my property. The meeting was recorded. Roth herself bragging about the manipulated maps and how we can make the problem disappear once the county clears the paperwork. When the footage aired, it detonated like dynamite. The state attorney general launched an inquiry into Crystal Ridge HOA for fraud and coercion. Members resigned in droves. Roth vanished from public view. But even then, victory felt hollow. My shack was vandalized again, This time, the deck torched, the dock gone. Watching it burn reflected in the lake's surface was like seeing a piece of my soul turn to ash. I stood there, trembling, rain beginning to fall, whispering to myself, "You can burn the wood, but you can't burn what it stands for." The next day, I filed for reconstruction permits, not to rebuild the shack as it was, but to build something untouchable. I drew plans for a hybrid structure, part living space, part museum, dedicated to documenting the corruption of homeowner associations. My lawyers advised caution. "You've made enemies with deep pockets," they warned. But I smiled. "Then let's make it public." We launched a crowdfunding campaign titled Rebuild the $5 Miracle House. It raised $500,000 in 48 hours. Donations poured in from across the country. People who'd faced their own HOA nightmares. People who saw in my story their own defiance. For the first time in years, I didn't feel alone. But just as the concrete for the new foundation was poured, I received a letter that chilled me more than any threat. It was from a private investment group offering to buy the entire property, lakefront, brand rights, and all, for $5 million. No HOA logo, no corporate name, just a single signature at the bottom, C. Roth Holdings, LLC. That was when I realized Cynthia hadn't disappeared. She'd evolved. She was no longer playing by HOA rules. She was building a shadow company to reclaim everything she'd lost. And I knew this was the beginning of the final reckoning. I stared at the letter for what felt like hours, the inked signature of C. Roth Holdings, LLC, burning into my vision like a brand I couldn't erase. It wasn't just a business proposal. It was a declaration of war written in gold leaf and greed. The offer was precise, ruthless, and eerily poetic. $5 million for a property once worth $5. A full-circle temptation designed to buy my silence, erase the story, and reframe history in her favor. But I'd learned long ago that some offers are just traps, dressed as generosity. I didn't reply. Not immediately. I needed to know what game she was playing now that she'd shed the skin of the HOA queen and emerged as a corporate predator. The first clue came from an unexpected source, a young paralegal from the firm representing me, named Julia Hart. She'd been with the team since my case started. Quiet, efficient, with that relentless curiosity only the honest possess. One evening, while combing through filings, she found something buried in the corporate registry. Roth's new company wasn't just buying lake properties, it was acquiring land around the lake, piece by piece, through shell entities. Their goal wasn't my shack alone, it was total control of the entire waterfront, repackaged as the Crystal Ridge Redevelopment Initiative, a luxury eco-resort backed by shadow investors. My house, now famous worldwide, was the missing jewel in her crown, the story she needed to rebrand the past and sell her empire of lies as redemption. When Julia showed me the paperwork, my gut twisted. The corporate filings bore familiar names, former HOA members, county surveyors, even a judge from the zoning commission, all shareholders in her new venture. The web was wide, sticky, and suffocating. I realized that my fight had outgrown the lake. I wasn't battling a neighborhood anymore. I was up against a machine. But machines have one weakness. They can't handle chaos. So I became chaos. Instead of refusing Roth's offer, I accepted a meeting. She wanted control. I wanted to see her eyes when I ripped it away. We met at a glass-walled restaurant overlooking the lake. She arrived in a white suit, calm as an executioner. "You've built quite a legend, Mr. Cross," she said, smiling like a shark. "It's time to give it a legacy." I let her talk, about partnerships, publicity, sustainability, all buzzwords dripping with hypocrisy. Finally, I leaned forward and said quietly, "You think you're buying a house. You're really buying evidence." Her eyes flickered, just for a second. That was all I needed. I slid a flash drive across the table. "Drone footage, county emails, and voice recordings linking your board to the rezoning fraud. If I go missing, it all goes public." Her face didn't change, but her hand trembled slightly as she set down her wine glass. "You're bluffing," she hissed. "Am I?" I smiled. "Ask your old surveyor about the data packet labeled Ridge-proof. He's been talking to the Attorney General." The color drained from her cheeks. I stood up, left the drive on the table, and walked out without looking back. That night, my phone lit up with messages from unknown numbers, warnings, threats, bribes, but I ignored them all. Instead, I went live. I streamed from my shack's deck, the moon glittering off the water like liquid silver, and told the world everything: the boundary fraud, the corporate laundering, the intimidation, the arson. My voice shook at first, but as I spoke, it steadied. "They laughed when I bought this place for $5, I said. "Now it's worth $5 million, but not because of money, because it stands for every person who refused to bow to greed." Within hours, the stream hit millions of views. Donations poured in again. The hashtag #OurLakeShackLegacy trended worldwide. But the next morning, I woke to sirens. County officers surrounded my property, warrant in hand, claiming I'd violated environmental codes. They seized my equipment, taped off the site, and served me a court summons for public endangerment. It was Roth's counterstrike, her last desperate attempt to bury me under bureaucracy. I was hauled before a federal judge within days, the courtroom packed with press. My lawyer whispered, "They're trying to force a settlement. They'll offer you immunity if you sign over the land." I glanced across the aisle. Roth, immaculate as ever, eyes cold and triumphant. I smiled, because what she didn't know was that Julia had already leaked everything to a whistleblower network. The night before the hearing, they'd published a 200-page exposé with documents, emails, and video evidence linking Roth's LLC to illegal zoning manipulations, false environmental reports, and offshore accounts. When the judge entered the courtroom, his first words weren't to me, they were to her. "Ms. Roth, it appears your organization is under federal investigation for fraud, extortion, and environmental racketeering." The silence that followed was thick enough to drown in. Her lawyers scrambled, her mask cracked. For the first time, I saw fear in her eyes. She turned toward me, lips trembling, and whispered something I'll never forget. "You should have taken the money." I leaned closer and whispered back, "You should have left me alone." The next weeks unfolded like a slow-motion implosion. Roth's assets were frozen. Her board members flipped for immunity. The county clerk resigned. Even the judge who'd backed her was indicted. Crystal Ridge HOA was dissolved by state order, its accounts seized and audited. But justice is never clean. It leaves behind scars, empty spaces where years of struggle once lived. I walked through the ruins of what had been my home, half rebuilt after the fire, scaffolding framing the horizon like broken ribs. The silence was heavier now, but it wasn't lonely. It was sacred. The state offered to buy the property as a protected heritage site. I refused. Instead, I reopened the crowdfunding page, promising to finish what I'd started. Rebuilding the shack, not as a house, but as a living museum, a monument to ordinary defiance. Volunteers came from across the country, carpenters, architects, even college students. We worked through rain, through exhaustion, through memories that still smelled of smoke. Slowly, the shack rose again, not polished or perfect, but proud. The day we finished, I stood on the new dock, looking out across the lake that had witnessed everything: the laughter, the fire, the betrayal, the rebirth. A young reporter asked me, "Was it worth it? All of this?" I smiled. "It was never about what it's worth," I said. "It's about who you become when they try to take it away." As we raised the new sign, Lake Shack Legacy Museum, St. 1953, rebuilt 2025. I saw crowds gathering, cameras flashing, drones buzzing overhead. Somewhere in the crowd, I thought I saw a familiar figure: white suit, blonde hair, sunglasses. But when I looked again, she was gone. Maybe it was my mind playing tricks, or maybe it was a reminder that some wars never truly end. But I knew one thing for sure. They could steal money, they could twist laws, they could even burn my home, but they could never erase the truth. The lake had remembered everything, just like the old widow said it would. And now, so would the world. I used to think the fight ended when the courts ruled, when the signatures dried and the news cycle moved on. But that was naive. Battles don't end when the headlines fade. They just slip underground, waiting for the silence to thicken enough to breathe again. For a while, it felt like peace. The new Lake Shack Legacy Museum opened that summer, and crowds came in droves. Families, students, retirees. They walked through my rebuilt living room, now lined with photos, documents, and burnt wood preserved in glass. The scars turned into testimony. I gave tours sometimes, told the story to those who needed to hear that ordinary people could still stand up against corruption. Donations kept it running, local businesses thrived again, and the lake sparkled under sunlight like nothing had ever happened. But behind the calm, something stirred. It began with letters, unsigned, typed, postmarked from cities I'd never visited. Each one shorter than the last, but all carrying the same message. It isn't over. At first, I dismissed them as trolls, bitter remnants of the old HOA loyalists. Then came the audit. A state inspector arrived one morning, polite but nervous, claiming they needed to verify the museum's property tax classification. I handed over the documents myself, every receipt, every permit, every legal stamp. He flipped through the pages, frowned, and muttered, "That's odd." I asked what he meant, but he just shook his head and left. That night, I logged into the county records to double-check the files, and my blood ran cold. The digital map showed a new overlay, a rezoning proposal marked pending review. And there it was again, C. Roth Holdings, LLC. After everything, after indictments, after public disgrace, she'd found a way back, through proxies, shell names, and foreign capital. But this time, it wasn't just about the shack or even the lake. The documents described a sweeping eco-development corridor stretching through 3 counties, targeting historic and protected properties for rehabilitation. They wanted to turn every story like mine into a marketing slogan. I felt the old anger ignite, that sharp, cold fire that once fueled every sleepless night during the fight. I called Julia, now my closest ally and the de facto manager of the museum. She came over within the hour, her face pale but determined. "They're laundering legitimacy," she said, scanning the proposal. "They'll use your legacy as their proof of concept. You fought them so hard you made their model valuable." I slammed my fist on the desk. "Over my dead body." She looked at me, quiet for a long time. "Then you better be ready to do it again." We spent days pulling records, tracing the companies funding the corridor project. It led us to a single firm based in Chicago, Vanguard Synergetics Local Teed, an investment group with no website, no real presence, but an address matching an abandoned office lot. When we dug deeper, we found that its director was one Charles Roth, Cynthia's husband. He'd stayed silent through the trials, sold off their mansion, moved their money offshore, and now he was back to finish what she started. The realization hit me like a hammer. They weren't fighting to win back a house. They were building an empire of rehabilitation, turning public outrage into profit. The next step was obvious: expose them again. But unlike last time, there were no smoking guns, no recorded confessions. They'd learned from their mistakes, layering their crimes behind legality and polished PR. The world had moved on. The audience that once rallied for me now scrolled past. Outrage fatigue had set in. I knew I couldn't win with noise this time. I had to win with precision. So I went quiet. Over the next month, I began documenting everything, their filings, their lobbyists, their front companies, and reached out to old allies in the Attorney General's office. Some were sympathetic, others cautious. "Roth's name is poison in politics," one said. "No one wants to touch it again." But I didn't need politics. I needed the truth. And the truth had a way of slipping through cracks no matter how much concrete you pour over it. Julia and I found one, an accountant from Roth's firm, recently fired for compliance breaches. We tracked her down to a small apartment 2 towns over. She was scared, jittery, chain-smoking by the window. "They said it was for sustainability grants," she whispered. "But the money, it's coming from overseas shell banks. They're cleaning dirty funds through environmental projects. Your museum was used as the face of the operation." My stomach turned. They'd taken my story, my fight, and twisted it into a laundering tool. "I can prove it," she said, handing me a flash drive. "Everything's on here. But once you open it, they'll know." I didn't hesitate. That night, as the lake glimmered outside my window, I loaded the files. Transactions, correspondence, bribes, each folder was a deeper pit of rot. The Roths weren't just scheming. They were connected to international developers tied to offshore smuggling, using the eco-corridor as a front. I knew what this meant. I wasn't fighting an HOA anymore. I was fighting a Hydra. I sent encrypted copies to my contacts, scheduled timed releases online in case anything happened to me. I'd learned that lesson already. Insurance was survival. Then I called Julia. "It's bigger than we thought," I said. "We go public tomorrow." But tomorrow never came as planned. At dawn, a thunderous crash woke me. My front window shattered. Smoke filled the room. I grabbed my phone and bolted outside as the museum's roof erupted in flames. Fire trucks arrived within minutes, but by then, half the structure was gone. They called it an electrical malfunction, but I knew better. The next morning, a news drone captured the image of me standing in the ashes, charred wood, blackened signs, and the shattered remains of the dock. Within hours, the same corporate page promoting the eco-corridor posted a statement. "Tragic fire at Lake Shack Legacy Site highlights the need for modernized safety infrastructure in rural zones." They were already spinning the narrative, using my loss as marketing fuel. I didn't even cry. I just felt empty, as if grief had become too familiar to sting. Julia urged me to leave, to rebuild elsewhere, but I couldn't. "This lake," I said, voice cracking. "This ground, it's the only place they can't rewrite." That night, as I sat on the steps overlooking the blackened shoreline, headlights appeared in the distance. A car stopped at the gate. Out stepped Cynthia Roth. Older, thinner, but unmistakably herself. No security, no entourage, just her standing under the moonlight. "You should have stayed quiet," she said softly. "You got what you wanted. Fame, money, your little shrine. Why keep pushing?" I stared at her, smoke still curling from the ruins behind me. "Because you never stopped taking." She smiled faintly, almost pitying. "You think this matters? There will always be another Roth, another Lake, another man like you who thinks defiance is virtue. You can't beat the system, you can only feed it." I walked closer until I could see the reflection of flames in her eyes. "Maybe," I said. "But the system's scared of one thing." "What's that?" she asked. "A man with nothing left to lose." I handed her a printed document, a notarized affidavit attached to a QR code. "That drive you burned? Copies went global an hour ago. Every file, every transaction. You're done." For the first time, she didn't speak. She just turned, walked back to her car, and drove into the dark. I stood there for a long time, watching her taillights disappear, feeling something between relief and sorrow. I didn't know if I'd won or merely survived. But as the wind picked up and the lake shimmered faintly beneath the smoke, I realized something. Survival itself was victory. They could rebuild, rename, rebrand, but they'd never undo the truth that had already escaped into the world. Julia joined me at dawn, eyes red but hopeful. "What now?" she asked. I looked at the rising sun painting the water gold. "Now," I said, "we build again. But not from wood this time, from memory." When the fires were finally out and the smoke no longer curled like ghosts over the water, silence took the lake again, the kind of silence that hums, that breathes, that feels like a heartbeat buried under the surface. For weeks I avoided the ashes. I told myself I was too busy coordinating the investigations, talking to lawyers, speaking at town halls, but the truth was simpler. I was afraid to face what remained. The museum had been more than a building. It was a promise, a monument to resilience. Now it was gone, reduced to soot and twisted metal. And yet, every morning I found myself walking to the same spot where the old dock had been, staring into the water that reflected the wreckage like a mirror of memory. One morning, as fog drifted across the lake, Julia joined me, carrying 2 cups of coffee. She said nothing, just stood beside me until the sun began to rise, cutting through the mist. "You know," she said quietly, "every great story has to end somewhere." I took the cup, staring at the golden light shimmering over the water. "Yeah," I said, "but some stories don't end. They just change form." She smiled faintly, her eyes tired but soft. "Then maybe it's time you start writing a new one." In the weeks that followed, the fallout from the leaked documents shook more than just our small county. National agencies stepped in, tracing the Roths' laundering network through shell companies across continents. Cynthia and Charles Roth were arrested at a private airstrip in Nevada, caught trying to flee under fake identities. News outlets replayed the footage endlessly. Cynthia in handcuffs, head down, surrounded by flashing lights. I didn't celebrate. There was no triumph left in me, only a weary relief that justice, however flawed, had found its way through the cracks. The Attorney General personally called to thank me for my cooperation. "You exposed one of the most sophisticated land fraud networks in state history," he said. I wanted to tell him that I never meant to expose a network, that I only wanted to keep my home, but the words caught in my throat. Sometimes you start a fight small and end up standing against a storm far larger than you ever imagined. After the arrests, the state offered compensation for damages, enough to rebuild twice over, but I declined. Money had lost its meaning the moment greed set fire to my peace. Instead, I asked for something simpler: legal designation of the property as a protected landmark, immune to future rezoning, immune to acquisition. The legislature approved it unanimously, the first of its kind. A private home granted historic preservation status for what it represented, not what it was. They called it the Lake Shack Preservation Act, and journalists said it symbolized the triumph of individual resilience over institutional abuse. But for me, it was just closure, a way to ensure no one could ever erase what had happened here again. Julia helped me clear the debris. Day by day, plank by plank, we salvaged what we could. The air still smelled faintly of char and rain. The dock was gone, but the pilings remained, stubborn as the day I'd first found them 20 years ago. We didn't talk much during those weeks. Some silences don't need filling. We worked until sunset, until our hands blistered, until the sound of hammers and saws became a kind of prayer. And then one evening, as the sky bled orange over the lake, she said, "You know, the world still remembers you as the guy who bought a shack for $5. I laughed softly. "Guess I'll die with that title." She turned toward me. "You could build anything now, start fresh, somewhere new. Why stay here?" I looked out across the water, where ripples caught the fading light like liquid gold. "Because this place fought with me," I said. "It took every storm, every fire, every lie, and it's still standing. Maybe that's all I ever wanted, to know something could survive." She nodded slowly. "Then let's make it worthy of surviving." We rebuilt again, but not as a museum this time. This time it was a community space, a learning center for homeowners' rights, sustainable living, and small-town resilience. We named it the Lake House Project, funded entirely by public donations and volunteer labor. It wasn't grand or commercial. It was simple, raw, honest. We kept the scars, charred beams as part of the architecture, cracks in the floor sealed under glass. Every imperfection told a story. When the building finally opened, the same reporters who once swarmed the courtroom returned, older, quieter, more respectful. They asked if I had any final words for the people watching. I thought for a long time before answering. "They say property is about ownership," I said. "But what I learned is that it's really about belonging, about finding one patch of earth that won't turn its back on you, even when the world does." They tried to take that from me. But what they didn't understand is that you can't steal something that's already part of who you are. The crowd clapped, but it wasn't the applause that stayed with me. It was the sound of the lake, soft against the dock, steady and eternal. Years passed. The headlines faded. The world found new scandals, new heroes, new villains. But the lake remained the same. Sometimes school children visited on field trips, their teachers telling them about the man who fought the HOA and won. They'd look at me, gray-haired now, wearing the same boots from that first day, and ask, "Did they really laugh at you when you bought it?" I'd smile. Oh, they laughed. But laughter doesn't last as long as truth. And they'd giggle, run down to the water, toss pebbles that rippled across the surface where once stood my $5 miracle shack. One autumn evening, after closing up, I sat alone on the deck with a notebook. The sun dipped low, and the water mirrored it like liquid fire. I began writing, not legal notes or press statements, just memories. The widow who sold me the shack. The first night the roof leaked. The smell of cedar and rain after I fixed the first wall. The laughter that tried to break me. The storm that spared me. The fire that almost ended me. Every piece stitched together into something like peace. Julia joined me, her hands streaked with sawdust, hair tousled from the wind. "You're writing again?" she said softly. "Yeah," I murmured. "Just trying to remember it right." She leaned on the railing beside me. "You ever think about selling it now? I mean, it's worth more than ever. Someone would pay millions." I shook my head, smiling faintly. "I already sold it once, in spirit. Cost me everything to buy it back," she laughed. "Fair enough." We stood there as night settled in, the lake glimmering under starlight. For the first time in years, I felt no anger, no fear, no bitterness. Just calm. The kind of calm that only comes after surviving your own story. Before we went inside, I looked out one last time and whispered to the lake. "You remembered, didn't you?" The water rippled as if answering. I thought about that old widow's words from long ago, "The lake remembers everything." Maybe she was right. Maybe the earth keeps the truth even when people try to bury it. I left the notebook open on the railing, the breeze flipping its pages. Inside were all the words I'd never said aloud, the confessions, the regrets, the gratitude. Someday someone else would find it. Maybe a wanderer or a dreamer who'd see what I once saw in the ruin of a forgotten shack. Possibility. As I walked back toward the warm glow of the house, I turned once more to look behind me. The reflection of the lake shimmered like a window into the past. I could almost see it. The crooked roof, the sagging dock, the $5 miracle standing proud against the laughter of the world. And for a fleeting second, I thought I saw her too, the widow smiling faintly from the water's edge. Or maybe it was just memory taking shape, reminding me that every ending is just another ripple in time. Either way, I smiled back. Because after everything, after all the fires, fights, betrayals, and rebuilding, I'd finally learned what victory really meant. It wasn't wealth or fame or even justice. It was peace.